Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. So, I would like to thank you, Dr. Robtel Neajai Pailey, for agreeing to be here today and enlightening us with her fantastic and also thought-provoking research. Robtel is Assistant Professor in International Social and Public Policy at LSE, very close to us. But what I like about her work is that she's not just academic, She's a Liberian scholar activist working at the intersection of critical development studies, critical African studies, and critical race studies. She centers her research on how structural transformation is conceived and contested by local, national, and transactional actors from crisis-affected regions of the so-called Global South. So it's a very different lenses to look into development, which is, that's why I thought it was thought-provoking. So her talk today will be based on her most recent book called Development, Dual Citizenship, and it's this content in Africa, the political economy of belonging to Liberia. So it was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. You were giving a tour during the pandemic, an online tour of the book, which was very exciting. So I just want to mention that Robtel's book is not only reflects the particularities of the development processes in post-colonial countries with a history of war, conflict, but also it reflects a brilliant academic trajectory by Robtel, starting at SOAS, a PhD at SOAS. I have to mention that because my PhD is also from SOAS. That was funded by Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And then a level early career fellow at University of Oxford, which is fantastic. So thank you for being here today with us. Thank you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for the invitation, and to everyone who was a part of organizing this this seminar. So the IIPP, UCL, Maddie, and I'm forgetting the other person's name who's trying to hide and run away, Sylvia. Thank you so much. I'm always remiss in not acknowledging people who always sit sort of in the background, but do all the heavy lifting. So I want to make sure to acknowledge you and thank you for all of your work. In addition to Carolina for the invitation to join you today. So it's a nice intimate group. I won't stand because I feel like I'm all lectured out. It's been an intense term at the LSE, as is the case probably at UCL as well. So I'm just going to sit here and have a nice intimate conversation with you about the book, if that's all right with you. So as Carolina mentioned, this presentation is based on my monograph that was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. And people often ask me what was a sort of seed that was planted and why did I decide to embark on this particular study. So I'll talk about it a little bit throughout the presentation, but after graduating from Oxford with my master's, I was probably in my mid-20s, and I got this incredible opportunity to work with and for the first elected woman head of state in Africa, in Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And I worked directly with her in some respects as her speechwriter, but then I went on to do other things. One of the things she asked me to do was to work on a diaspora engagement strategy for the government because we were in this really dynamic post-war moment, and we wanted to figure out a way to engage those who had left the country either before, during, or after the armed conflict of 1989 to 2003. And I had worked on diaspora engagement in my master's thesis. So one of the things that kept coming up when I was speaking to Liberians in North America, in Europe, in parts of Australia, in parts of West Africa, is, okay, we want to harness your political, economic, and social resources. And the pushback that I would get often is, okay, you want to harness our resources, but according to the Liberian law, if we naturalize abroad, we've automatically revoked our Liberian citizenship. So this sort of extractive tendency that the government has to take from us, what you need to do is reinstate our citizenship. And I thought, here's an interesting research question. Why is it that Liberia, considered a migratory nation given its history, and I'll talk about that history a little bit, has revoked or is one of the very few countries in the continent of Africa that doesn't have a dual citizenship law? What does this do in terms of understandings of belonging, understandings of citizenship, but then also understandings of how people engage in the post-war reconstruction process writ large? So that was a seed that was planted after I finished my 4-year stint at the Ministry of State of Presidential Affairs in Liberia. I came back to SOAS and did my PhD, and this was the sort of background of the PhD work that became the monograph. So the question that I asked today is, does dual citizenship reproduce inequalities? It's somewhat of a rhetorical question, and I think it'll be a conversation that we have during the Q&A. But I think one of the things that I came up with is, in some respects, yes, dual citizenship does reproduce inequalities on a number of different scales. And this is the feedback that I kept getting from people that I'd spoken to in these 5 different cities, 5 different countries, 3 continents. So in terms of the structure of the presentation, what I want to do first is to talk about what are my major arguments in the book. And then I want to shift gears to talk about what I believe are the major contributions. And these contributions are theoretical, they're methodological, as well as empirical. And last but certainly not least, I would say most importantly, I want to talk about what are the implications for not only policy, but also practice in Liberia, as well as across the continent of Africa. Because this book is about Liberia. It's a small case study on Liberia, but I try to make broader statements about what does this mean for the entire continent of Africa. Okay, so in terms of the major arguments that I make, so how many people are familiar with Liberia, just from a show of hands? A few of you? Okay. So if you are not aware, this book is a case study of Liberia. And what's interesting and unique about Liberia is that it was the first Black African republic. And as a result, it was really the first country in the continent of Africa to actually devise legal norms around citizenship, around membership, and around belonging. So this book is the first study that actually investigates both domestic as well as diasporic constructions and practices of citizenship across space and time, as well as their myriad implications for development. Now, in this book, I'm very clear about the fact that when I think and conceptualize development, I'm not just talking about the sort of free market capitalism, right? I'm not just focusing on the sort of single-minded approach to Western whiteness and modernity, or the privileging of Western whiteness and modernity. I'm also not talking about the sort of single-minded approach looking at economic growth. So when I talk about development in the book, what I'm really thinking about is how people's experiences of power, progress, privilege are constantly mediated to affect broader processes of political, economic, and social change. And what does that mean within the context of a post-war country like Liberia? So what I do throughout the book is I use a contested dual citizenship bill that was introduced in 2008, but basically lingered in legislative limbo for 10 years. It wasn't passed between 2008 and 2018 to ask broader questions about, again, what does it mean to be a citizen in a post-war country domestically, but also transnationally? And how does this affect people's development practices domestically as well as diasporically? So there are 3 major arguments that I put forward. The first is, while mid-19th century to mid-20th century Liberian citizenship was largely passive and constructed from above by an all-powerful hegemonic state, mid-20th century to present-day Liberian citizenship has largely been constructed from below by citizens themselves through processes of protest. And this was manifested in a number of political upheavals throughout the country's history, but also its more recent armed conflict of 1989 to 2003. Now, why is this? In the book, there are 3 thematic, sort of contemporary as well as historical processes that I talk about. The first is processes of conflict, the second is processes of migration, and then the third is processes of post-war reconstruction in the 21st century. Now, let's talk about migration within the context of migration. So I mentioned earlier that Liberia is considered a country that has a migratory history. What's interesting about Liberia is that in the mid-19th century, when the country was established as the first Black African Republic in 1847, it was considered a country of relative immigration, right? IMMI. The vast majority of people who came to Liberia traveled from places like the Congo River Basin. They came from the United States, sort of fleeing economic servitude and racial injustice in the United States. Free Blacks, this is. Some of them were manumitted, but the vast majority of them who came from the United States were free Blacks who basically left. They were fed up, tired. There were also free Blacks who came from the Caribbean, right? Now, these free Blacks effectively created citizenship tiers in which they were at the very top, right? So Liberia was considered a country of relative immigration. However, citizenship laws, norms around membership, around belonging, were biased against what I call the rooted indigene. And as is the case of human history, whenever a country is discovered or established, they're usually people who already are there, right? So when these free blacks came from the United States, from the Congo River Basin, as well as from the Caribbean, they encountered indigenous populations who lived on the coast, but also in the hinterland. And these indigenous populations, for the first 100 years, so for the first century of Liberia's existence as Africa's first Black republic, citizenship laws and norms were biased against what I call these rooted indigenes, right? The people who were already there when the Black settlers arrived. What's interesting is that now, in the 21st century, Liberia is considered a country of relative emigration, EMI, right? There are more people leaving the country than who are settling in the country. However, legal norms around citizenship, membership, and belonging before our dual citizenship law was passed in July 2022 were biased against what I call the rootless immigrant, right? So these are Liberians who left before the War of 1989, during the War of 1989 to 2003, or even after the war, right? Before July 2022, Liberia is one of 7 countries in the continent of Africa that didn't recognize dual citizenship. So our laws and norms were biased against these rootless immigrants. Now there's a caveat in the law. So the law states that, or the law stated, I should say, I always have to remind myself that the law has been passed. So before the dual citizenship law was passed in July 2022, what our law said was that if you left Liberia and you had a Liberian citizenship by birth and you naturalized abroad, you would automatically revoke your Liberian citizenship, right? Now, if you were a Liberian by ancestry, so you happen to have been born outside of the country to a Liberian citizen father, so our laws were very, very biased against Liberian women being able to pass on citizenship to their children. So if you were born abroad to a Liberian citizen father, you had to declare at the age of majority, so effectively between 18 and 23, whether you wanted to maintain your jus soli, foreign citizenship by birth, or your jus sanguinis, Liberian citizenship by ancestry. So at the age of 23, you had to decide. So it was still biased against these so-called rootless immigrant Liberian citizens by ancestry, right? Now, this isn't surprising because a number of scholars, such as Mahmoud Mamdani, whose work you might be familiar with, who wrote the famous book, Citizen and Subject, focusing on South Africa, but across the continent writ large. So people like Mahmoud Mamdani or even Bronwyn Mamby, a colleague of mine at the LSE, have argued that the countries in Africa that have had the highest levels of colonial era migration are the countries that have the most viscerally contested citizenship norms, right? And although Liberia was not formally colonized by European powers, it was one of 2 countries, Ethiopia being the second, that was not formally colonized by European powers, it did experience heightened levels of colonial era migration of these Black settlers who came from the Congo River Basin, the United States, as well as the Caribbean, right? So it's not surprising that Liberia has these viscerally contested norms around citizenship and belonging. The second argument that I make is that the 21st century gridlock, or the sort of contestations around citizenship and dual citizenship, is emblematic of these enduring struggles of Liberian citizenship across space and time. So as I mentioned earlier, Liberia is one of only 7 countries before July 2022 that prohibited dual citizenship. At the time, the other 6 were Cameroon, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. The third argument that I make is that domestic and diasporic Liberians interpret and understand or conceptualize citizenship and even practice citizenship differently based on what Norman Long, the development sociologist, calls their lived experiences or their life worlds and their social locations, which is their socioeconomic backgrounds. And this was definitely emblematic when I interviewed my interlocutors in the 5 cities, 5 countries, 3 continents. So a number of domestic Liberians that I spoke to said effectively that dual citizenship is a zero-sum game, that it would reproduce inequalities, that it would privilege an already privileged group of transnational actors who live abroad, and that it would infringe upon their very limited access to political, economic, and social rights. However, when I spoke to Liberians abroad, many of whom had revoked their Liberian citizenship by moving abroad, but many of whom had kept or held on to their Liberian citizenship for fear of not being able to practice Liberian citizenship from afar, argued that dual citizenship would actually expand their ability to engage with the homeland politically, economically, and socially, that they would invest more, that they would send more remittances, that they would become politically engaged in a way that they weren't before. And so this, passing dual citizenship, would actually enhance the development dividends of the country. So you already see the sort of polarization between what I call domestic anxieties and diasporic aspirations. So I'm a big fan of alliteration. You'll see a lot of that in the book. And even people have commented on me and they said, oh, you really like alliteration, don't you, right? So domestic anxieties versus diasporic aspirations. So I'll turn to some quotes that I pulled from two of my interlocutors who were policymakers at the time when I interviewed them. So effectively what I argue throughout the book is that this bill, this viscerally contested bill, reveals these diasporic aspirations, but then it reveals the domestic anxieties. So the first quote is from Cletus Watterson. He was a former senator, or senator at the time when I interviewed him, and also the chief sponsor of the 2008 dual citizenship bill. And what does he say? He says, you know, a lot of them Liberians living abroad had to change their lifestyle, accept the dictates from a strange country for survival. In some countries, it meant you had to become a citizen of that country to enjoy the benefits, and that's certainly the case, right? But in taking that involuntary stance, it qualified them for disqualification of their citizenships in their own country, Liberia, which I believe is unfair. Now, as an aside, I want to mention that I found out after the interview that I did with Senator Watterson is that one of his main sort of impetuses for sponsoring the dual citizenship bill is that he had grandchildren and children who lived in the United States. And given the law, he would not be able to pass on any acquired property to these children and grandchildren, children who had naturalized abroad, and then grandchildren who were American citizens by ancestry. So there are all these sorts of interesting agendas being put forward by policymakers that may not necessarily be explicit from the word go, but I did find that out as an aside later. Very, very staunch proponent of dual citizenship. There's another quote from a co-sponsor of the bill, Jewel Howard Taylor, who was a senator at the time, and then eventually became vice president. She's vice president now. And she said, and I believe that her quote is definitely emblematic of these the domestic anxieties. She says, Liberians here, Liberia, a lot of them are not working. They're unemployed and they feel as if Liberians coming from the diaspora who have had all of these opportunities, whether that's true or not, right? Perception versus reality, want to come and take their space. Now she's talking about so-called unemployed Liberians, but a lot of Liberians that I interviewed throughout the 12 months that I spent in the country, domestic Liberians, many of them were employed. In fact, many of them were doing relatively well. And they still had these domestic anxieties about, again, the idea of privileging an already privileged transnational group of actors and then infringing upon their already limited political, economic, and social rights. So you see the dichotomy between the domestic and the diasporic, emblematic in these two quotes from the chief sponsors of the bill. In fact, as another aside, Jewel Howard Taylor, after I grilled her for about an hour during our interview, she eventually relented and said that she had political misgivings about having sponsored the bill because it would have dire consequences for her own political future in Liberia. So she said at some point, she said during the interview, well, what does it mean if we pass dual citizenship and someone who has all of these resources from abroad comes back to Liberia and wants to run for the presidency? That could be contestation for me because we knew that she had these sort of political ambitions. She actually admitted this during the interview. And she said, wait a second, Robtel, I think I have two minds about this bill now. I'm not really sure if I'm going to sponsor it or continue to push for its passage in the Liberian Senate. So there are other things that I try to do throughout the book. And the first is that I attempt, and I think that I succeed in, providing a critical framing of citizenship, right? So citizenship, as far as I'm concerned, is a continuum of both inclusion as well as exclusion, right? Citizenship in the literature, it's theorized in a number of different forms, is that citizenship is multi-layered, right? Citizenship is differentiated by race, is differentiated by class, it's differentiated by ethnicity, it's differentiated by gender. And that's certainly the case. I mentioned earlier that Liberian law, and this is not just unique to Liberia, but a lot of laws, you could even call it a colonial kind of artifact. A lot of laws across the globe are very, very sexist in terms of allowing or disenabling women from passing on citizenship to their children. So before the dual citizenship law of Liberia was passed, Liberian citizens and women couldn't pass on citizenship to their children born abroad. The other thing that's interesting about Liberian citizenship is that it's differentiated by race, and it still is differentiated by race. So the new project that I'm working on is called Africa's Negro Republics, and it focuses on this very peculiar and interesting thing about the Liberian citizenship laws is the case in Sierra Leone as well. So Liberia and Sierra Leone are the only two countries in the continent of Africa that have race-based citizenship clauses, right? They're called Negro clauses. And they effectively state that people of non-Negro, non-blacks, are not entitled to not entitled to citizenship. Now, Sierra Leone's Negro clause is a little bit more liberal than Liberia's. They enable non-blacks or non-Negroes to naturalize, whether they were born in the country or not. But Liberia doesn't allow naturalization, nor do they allow citizenship acquisition by birth. And this is a part of the sort of historical trajectory of the two countries, given that they have encounters or experiences with both slavery as well as colonialism. So those blacks who came from the Congo River Basin, the United States and the Caribbean, again, were fleeing racial injustice and economic servitude. So they wanted to establish a safe haven in the continent of Africa where they would be the ones who own the means of production. Land, for instance, was really, really important. And if you look at the laws in Liberia as well as Sierra Leone, land and citizenship are inextricably tied. So if you bar non-blacks from owning land, you bar non-blacks from having citizenship, you also bar them from owning land. So this is a new project that I'm working on. If you have questions about that, I can definitely answer them preliminarily. So there's a critical framing of citizenship, but there's also a critical framing of development. So as I mentioned earlier, I don't think of development solely as a sort of free market capitalism or the single-minded pursuit of economic growth. I'm really interested in development as this idea of broad-based socioeconomic transformation. So I frame development as a process of both amelioration, betterment, movement, progress, moving forward, but also a process of degeneration, depending on the perspective. So as far as some people are concerned in Liberia, dual citizenship is a development disenabler. Others believe that dual citizenship is a development enabler, right? Amelioration and degeneration in the same particular plane. What I do throughout the book is I also try to interrogate this sort of presumed symbiotic relationship between development and dual citizenship. Some people will argue if you pass dual citizenship, there will be broad-based development, right? That's not necessarily the case. In Liberia, across as well as in these transnational spaces, dual citizenship is viscerally contested in the same way that development is viscerally contested. So there are a number of critiques of dual citizenship. The first is that dual citizenship extends rights without necessarily extracting responsibilities, right? So there's a book, a chapter by Peter Spiro, who's a big kind of dual citizenship scholar, and he says that dual citizenship is really about citizenship a la carte, right? It's about these menu of different rights and privileges that you can choose from if you have multiple citizenships or two citizenships. But there's very little that's demanded of you in terms of responsibilities, in terms of obligations, right? The other argument that's made in terms of a critique of dual citizenship is that there really is no empirical correlation between the enactment of dual citizenship across the world and then also the enactment of dual citizenship in Africa and increased levels of economic contributions by those who live abroad or those who might have two citizenships or multiple citizenships. There hasn't been any sort of study that's proven a sort of empirical correlation between enacting dual citizenship and increased economic contributions by those abroad. So those are some of the broad-based critiques of dual citizenship that have been proven in the context of Africa, but also outside of the continent of Africa. The third thing that I try to do is I try to center the domestic citizenship contributions of those in the country, right? So as far as I'm concerned, these contributions that Liberians in the country make are key to socioeconomic transformation. Quite often in the literature, there's a literature that often privileges the citizenship contributions of those transnational actors or domestic or diasporic actors. And what I state throughout my book is that let's look at the domestic. Let us use that as a unit of analysis. In contrast, in comparison with those contributions or those citizenship contributions of those who might live abroad, right? Another thing that I do, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to this, is trying to offer a post-colonial critique of this sort of neoliberal framing of diasporas and donors as the panacea to post-war reconstruction. So forget about the state, forget about the government. Let's focus on these private kind of contributions from diasporas, but then also so-called donors, right? So what I demonstrate throughout the book is that diaspora citizenship claims, as well as their development claims, are equally contested. Diasporas might be a development enabler, but in some respects, they can also be a development spoiler, especially in post-war contexts where there has been some sort of political upheaval, right? And then last but certainly not least, I try to demonstrate that diasporas can be a silver lining, but they're definitely not a silver bullet. They're not the panacea to post-war reconstruction. If we think we are, we're seriously, seriously faulty in our thinking. So there's a whole chapter, and I told you about my alliteration fixation. There's a whole chapter called the dichotomy of diasporic developmentalism. I'll see if anybody can repeat that 5 or 6 times. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but the dichotomy of diasporic developmentalism. What I try to demonstrate throughout this book is that diasporas within the context of Liberia, but also outside of the continent, outside of the context of Liberia, have both helped as well as hindered post-war development. Now, how have they helped? So when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became president in 2006, she did this massive sort of recruitment drive. Most of those who came back, who were recruited for high-level positions, either ministerial positions or even heads of state-owned enterprises, so what we call the cash cows in Liberia, were headed by those who were recruited from abroad. So for instance, the Minister of Finance was someone who had worked in DC for the World Bank and the IMF. The Minister of National Defense had worked in parts of the US and parts of West Africa. The person who headed the Port Authority was someone who'd been recruited from the United States. So all of these SOEs, all of these ministerial posts as well as the SOEs that were responsible for driving development dividends in the country were headed by Liberians who'd been recruited from abroad. Now, the question a lot of people in the country asked was, what about those who were in the country? What about the domestically rooted Liberians who had important skills and in a context or understood the context of the country perhaps a little bit more than those who'd spent 20 years abroad, 30 years abroad, 15 years abroad? Now, full disclosure, I was one of those importees. Now, I wasn't a minister. At that point, I was not, I don't think I'd had enough experience to have a ministerial post, but I did work in the presidency as a speechwriter and then later on as a policymaker. And there was a lot of kind of pushback from people in the country asking us, well, what about someone who'd worked in the civil service for 20 years? What about their skills? Why is it that they're not being appointed minister or head of an SOE? So what I argue throughout the book is that these Liberians who came back and worked in these really high-level positions of influence and power in the executive branch of government were involved in public sector productivity. So for instance, the Minister of Finance, Antoinette Saye, who'd worked for the IMF and the World Bank, was able to negotiate for Liberia to get a $4.9 billion debt cancellation. And she was able to do that because she'd worked in these international financial institutions. She understood how they worked in terms of the sort of debt reduction. However, there were a number of people who shall remain nameless who were also very much implicated. Again, these importees or the returnees who'd worked in the government were implicated in what I call corrupt forms of post-war profiteering. I told you that I love that alliteration. Corrupt forms of post-war profiteering. So you've got the productivity, public sector productivity versus the corrupt forms of post-war profiteering. Now, there were high-profile graft cases in which a number of these Liberians who were recruited from abroad were implicated. Many of them were not prosecuted. Many of them, when they got implicated, what did they do? They packed up their bags and they left. So the pushback from domestic Liberians was, okay, we don't even have a dual citizenship bill and people are already flouting our laws, right? We don't even have a dual citizenship bill and people are evading the public trust. We don't even have a dual citizenship bill and people are engaged in these corrupt forms of post-war profiteering. What if we pass a bill? What happens? You almost open a Pandora's box for people to just do whatever they want because they eventually have the second passport and they can leave. Liberia has very few extradition treaties with countries abroad, right? So how do we ensure that people do not evade the public trust, especially when they are in these very, very high lucrative positions of power, right? So there's a term that I coined in the book, and the term is diasporas, right? So if you ever use that term, make sure you reference my book. And I came up with this term because effectively what does it mean is that it's this sort of outsized influence of diasporas or returnees in the managing of the affairs of the post-war government, or any government for that matter, right? So Sirleaf was not the only diasporacrat. I discovered that there were a number of other diasporacrats across the continent. Paul Kagame could be considered a near diasporacrat, right? Because he recruited people from the Central African region. You could also say that the former Somali president, Farmojo, I think that's his term of endearment, was a far diasporacrat because he recruited a lot of Somalis from abroad to come and work for the government and to steer the affairs of the government, right? Ashraf Ghani, for instance, could be considered an Afghan diasporacrat, right? So the sort of intentional effort to recruit citizens from abroad to come and work for the post-war government, or a government that has experienced some sort of political upheaval, is what I mean by diasporas. And what's interesting about this diasporas is that it effectively reproduced the international system of unequal pay. So a lot of international organizations like the World Bank, like the IMF, like the United Nations, will pay so-called expats who parachute in significantly more than so-called local experts, right? Or local staff. And I see people nodding their heads, so you've probably heard about this, read about it, experienced it yourself, right? Exorbitant amounts of money to parachute in at the expense of local workers who are paid a pittance comparatively, right? And they get all these kinds of benefits. Liberia reproduced that system of unequal pay because, surprise, surprise, not me, of course, those who'd been recruited from abroad were paid significantly more than those who were recruited locally, right? So ministers were making $10,000 a month in a post-war government that was crying for having resources or not having sufficient resources, right? Heads of SOEs were paid $15,000 a month compared to their local staff pay salaries. Almost just unconscionable, right? So this idea of reproducing the international system of unequal pay was a feature of this diasporas, and is a feature of diasporas across the globe, right? In many respects, you could say that there's a parallel between this diasporic hegemony and an expat hegemony that exists in post-war contexts like Liberia. So a lot of the domestic Liberians that I spoke to argued that in actuality, what you're doing is, if you enact dual citizenship, you will entrench the system of unequal pay because it'll become law, right? One of the anxieties that people had on the ground. So I'll switch gears to talk a little bit about some of my theoretical contributions. So how many people are familiar with Norman Long's notion of actor-oriented analysis? Does that ring a bell for anyone? Okay, so basically Norman Long argues that there's a theoretical framework that I use throughout the book called actor-oriented analysis. And Norman Long argues that in a development ecosystem, such as Liberia, for instance, different actors respond to development projects, development interventions, or even policy prescriptions that have development objectives, such as dual citizenship, quite differently based on their lived experiences, their life worlds, or their socioeconomic backgrounds, their social locations. But I think what's interesting about this particular conceptual framework is that Long argues that we can't assume that in this development ecosystem, those who might be seemingly more marginalized don't have agency, don't have the knowledgeability or the capacity to act. He says, even the most marginalized or seemingly marginalized actors in this development ecosystem, rural peasants, for instance, versus political bureaucrats in the city, have the capacity to act, right? Have the capacity to subvert sometimes the most best laid plans by those political actors who might seemingly be more powerful, right? And so what he says is that what we need to look at is something called the interface. He says that in a development ecosystem, there's a negotiation over these development projects, these policy prescriptions. And this negotiation occurs at the interface. In the interface, there can be a number of different outcomes, right? There can be divergence, in which there's confrontation, in which there's conflict, right? In which these development actors are unable to reconcile their differences. But there can also be convergence. There can be accommodation. There can be an agreement, right? And what's interesting about this particular theoretical framework, which I find particularly useful for the Liberia case study on dual citizenship, is that what I discovered is that domestic Liberians were just as powerful in pushing for the suspension of the dual citizenship bill, as diasporic Liberians were successful in pushing for the introduction and eventual passage of the bill much later, right? So you see the sort of negotiation happening amongst those seemingly less powerful actors against those seemingly more powerful actors at this particular interface. But I do something quite interestingly and different with the interface notion, right? So when Norman Long talks about the interface, he's really thinking about localized, kind of bounded encounters over actual development projects, and specifically within the context of rural settings, right? And I take this interface notion further to think about the interface as a transnational ideological exchange. There's no physical encounter that I'm talking about. It's really an ideological kind of transnational encounter that I'm talking about, right? And this battle is over both the merits as well as the demerits, right? The pros as well as the cons of enacting dual citizenship as a sort of proposed policy intervention that has development outcomes. The other thing that I do in the book is I theorize citizenship as a triad, right? So a number of scholars like Lisa Malky, who's based in California, have argued that identities, practices, relations between people transform in the aftermath of violent armed conflict. And this is certainly the case of Liberia, which had contested state formation in the mid-19th century, political upheaval in the 1980s, and then eventually all armed conflict between 1989 and 2003. So this is called the Liberian citizenship triad, but it's just not unique to Liberia. It's based on my empirical research. It can be used in any context. We can even say this is a function of the UK citizenship triad, right? So the three nodes of the triad say this. The first is that citizenship is identity, right? And when we think about identity, we can think about identity as a passive form of citizenship. It's by virtue of having been born in a particular locale. It's by virtue of maybe having ancestry from a particular locale. And there's really nothing that's required of you, right? So this particular node of the citizenship triad is about demanding rights, right? Think about the rights. Remember that, the alliteration, because it's coming back to haunt you. The second node is citizenship as a notion of practice. It's what you do with that identity that makes you a citizen, not the fact that you were born in a particular place or you claim citizenship because of ancestry. So it's the active form of citizenship. Do you pay your taxes? Is a question that kept coming up over and over again, right? Do you abide by the laws of the state, right? Do you, all the other things that you can think about in terms of obligations and responsibilities. This is what makes you a citizen. In fact, one of my interlocutors said, well, it's not about the passport you wield, because all of them are blue these days, right? That makes no difference as far as Liberians are concerned, right? Yes, identity is important, but it's only one very small node of the citizenship triad. It's that practice. In fact, a lot of Liberians that I spoke to, both in the country as well as outside of the country, kept equating citizenship to contribution. So as far as they were concerned, citizenship equals contribution, and that contribution can be manifested in so many different ways, right? Like varied ways. And in fact, the Minister of Justice, when I spoke to her, Christiana Ta, said, this idea or this notion that citizenship has transformed into contribution is really a function of the war that we experienced, right? It's a function or an outcome of the war, where people say, no, your responsibilities are to uphold peace and security in the country, right? Not to engage in sort of rebel faction war or to support a rebel faction from abroad, right? So what are those contributions that you make? That's what makes you a citizen. The third node of the citizenship triad is, okay, so the second node is about responsibilities, right? Rights first, responsibilities. And the third node of the citizenship triad is a set of relationships, right? And it's an interactive form of citizenship. It's how do you interact with your fellow citizen? How do you interact with your government, right? Rights, responsibilities, relationships. Those are the three nodes of the citizenship triad. And this came through the interviews that I did with these 200 plus Liberians in the country as well as outside of the country. I also theorize citizenship beyond the triad as a political economy of belonging. That's a subtext of the book, right? And so the political economy of belonging is the fact that socioeconomic transformation really depends on this exchange, right? It's a transnational or transactional kind of relationship. This exchange between rights, responsibilities. This exchange, or it depends on the fact that there's a provision of rights or privileging of rights, as well as the fulfillment of duties and obligations, so responsibilities, right? That exchange between rights and responsibilities. And then the last thing that I do in terms of theorization is thinking of citizenship from the perspective of a post-war African country of emigration. And I think this is important in terms of my contribution because quite often a lot of the citizenship literature focuses on citizenship generally as a very theoretical kind of thing, right? And it's in many respects also very Eurocentric. And so I was very intentional about ensuring that the sort of grounded theory that I build is from these interviews that I conducted with Liberians. So it theorizes citizenship from a post-war African emigration country of context. But it's not to say that it's only unique to the continent of Africa. As I mentioned, you can take this and extract it and use it in other contexts. So there can be a UK citizenship triad, there can be a Colombian citizenship triad, a Brazilian citizenship triad, a South Korean citizenship triad. And I think it makes sense because it's broad enough that you can use it in other contexts, but it's specific that it's come from this particular empirical study. Just a few more slides. So methodological and empirical contribution. So the book is based on these multi-sided interviews that I did. So it's a multi-sided study. Over 200 interviews that I did, in-depth interviews, semi-structured with primarily Liberian actors in the capital cities of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, UK, US. So Monrovia, Freetown, Accra, London, and Washington, DC. And it's sad that Saskia Sassen isn't here because I was going to just gush about her. So Saskia Sassen's work on the global city I drew a lot of inspiration from that because she talks about the fact that not only global cities, but cities writ large, right? So urban centers are the sites in which citizenship is most viscerally contested. So I wanted to test this out by interviewing Liberians in these capital cities in West Africa, in Europe, as well as in North America, right? Now, in many respects, and I admit this in the book, that the book has an urban bias. So perhaps if I'd interviewed Liberians in rural sectors or rural areas in Liberia, perhaps the responses of that triad might look a little bit differently. But it was a very intentional act because I was really interested in this idea of cities being the sites of viscerally contested citizenship, right? Maybe the next study that I do will focus on rural sectors. But the book also has a very sort of extensive comparative analysis. And I look at that contrast between what I call homelanders. So the vast majority of Liberians I interviewed in Monrovia were those who maybe never left Liberia, right? Or if they did, they left for very, very short periods. And these people that I interviewed, the homelanders, argue that they consider Liberia their only home. And Liberia's always been considered their only home. But I compare and contrast their experiences of citizenship, conceptualizations of citizenship, or even development practices with those returnees or reimportees like myself who came back for short stints, but also came back more permanently, right? I also compare and contrast the perspectives and experiences of executive members of government or policymakers, as well as legislative policymakers. What's interesting to me is that those legislative members of government that I interviewed were more wedded to the idea of passing a dual citizenship because obviously they were chief sponsors of the bill, but also co-sponsors of the bill. Those that I spoke to who had ministerial positions were very, very wary. So they had misgivings about passing dual citizenship because in many respects it would have unintended consequences for their own political futures, right? The last group of people that I sort of compare and contrast is what Nicholas Van Heer calls the near diaspora, so Liberians in the sub-region of West Africa, and the wider diaspora, so those who were further afield in parts of Europe and North America. This was very important to me in terms of this contrast, very intentional again, because quite often the literature on diasporas or migrants tends to focus on so-called global South migrants who go to the so-called global North. But we all know as migration scholars, or maybe we don't know, that the vast majority of migrants, global South migrants that is, don't go to the so-called global North. They stay in their regions of origin. And that's certainly the case within the continent of Africa. 80% of migration in Africa is intra-African. Africans go to other African countries. They don't clamor to go to the United States. They don't clamor to come to the UK, unlike the kind of mainstream reportage that we keep hearing about the migration crisis, right? So this is a fact, and I wanted to compare and contrast or bring to the fore the so-called near diaspora because they happen to be the vast majority of migrants. Certainly the case in Liberia, certainly the case in other contexts, right? what I discovered in sort of comparing and contrasting near diasporas versus wider diasporas is those wider diasporas happen to be the Liberians who were most likely to naturalize abroad. The near diasporas tended to hold on to their Liberian citizenship. Some of whom did because refugee laws within Sierra Leone and Ghana didn't enable them to naturalize until much, much later. But the other thing that I discovered in my research, even with the wider diasporas, those who naturalized, some of them were eligible 20 years before they actually naturalized, right? So I interviewed people in their 70s and their 80s who didn't naturalize until maybe 20 years after they were eligible to do so. There was a young woman that I spoke to who was in her 40s, and she'd been eligible to naturalize since she was 18, and she didn't naturalize until right before her 40th birthday. And I asked them, I probed them, why is it that it took you so long to naturalize, even long after eligibility? And they said, you know what? Because being Liberian was more important to me than having a US passport. Or being Liberian was more important to me than having a UK passport. Even though we all know, anyone who travels with a global North passport versus a global South passport, the difficulties of carrying a global South passport. But these Liberians that I interviewed said carrying that passport was a symbolic, sort of emblematic of my political economy of belonging to Liberia, even though having a US passport, having a UK passport, having a New Zealand passport would be easier for me in terms of integrating in the global kind of capitalist movement, right? So the point that I'm making in making this point is that quite often when we think about global South versus global North, so-called global South versus so-called global North passports, the assumption is that people from the so-called global South are clamoring for so-called global North passports, when that's actually not the case at all, right? They do it for very instrumental reasons, but if they had a choice, they would hold on to their so-called global South passport, no matter how difficult it is to travel with one, right? So you see this table where I have a breakdown of, the urban centers I interviewed, the diasporas, the homelanders, and the breakdown in terms of the numbers. So let's switch gears to talk about the implications for policymaking and practice in the last couple of slides. So this is a table that I generated from these interviews that I did. And you'll notice that amongst the 202 Liberian respondents that I spoke to, highlighted in green essentially is those Liberians who basically supported dual citizenship in principle, right? This was before the law was passed in July 2022. About 61 of my respondents. So what this demonstrates to me is, even though I've spoken to you quite frequently throughout the presentation about binaries, this domestic versus the diasporic, the vast majority of people I interviewed thought of dual citizenship in principle as a development enabler in Liberia, whether they happen to live in the country or outside of the country. But I've also highlighted in red those who viscerally rejected dual citizenship, about 18%. So, comparatively, it's not a large number, but look at where those 18% came from. Vast majority of those came from Monrovia, right? And if you break it down even more granularly, you realize that it's those homelanders that I talked about who consider Liberia their only home, who were the most viscerally opposed to dual citizenship, right? Now, this is a study of 200 plus Liberians. I'm very, very clear throughout the book that this is not representative of Liberians across the country. It's a qualitative study, right? So I was looking at certain trends amongst my respondent pool. However, what I did was I juxtaposed this or triangulated this with Afrobarometer survey data. How many people are familiar with Afrobarometer? So Afrobarometer is a Pan-African survey that's been around for about 30 years, and it measures political trends throughout the continent of Africa. What I discovered is I went to Afrobarometer, the surveys that were conducted in Liberia in 2012, as well as in 2018, and I discovered that there were actual questions about dual citizenship in both of those surveys. And surprise, surprise, about 2/3 of those who were surveyed in Liberia, in Monrovia as well as outside of Monrovia, were staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. 2/3, right? Definitely emblematic of the number of people I sort of interviewed in the country who were staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. But 61% were still thinking of dual citizenship in principle, as a development enabler, right? Now, Liberia had a national referendum in 2020. And what's interesting about this national referendum is that there were 8 propositions that were proffered. And the first proposition happened to be a dual citizenship bill. It did not garner the 2/3 majority required to pass. However, what's interesting to me is if you look in certain political subdivisions, and we call them counties in Liberia, the sub-political divisions that were viscerally opposed to dual citizenship in their majority, Montserrado, where Monrovia is located, surprisingly enough, Bomi County, Nimba County, Barbaloo, and Grand Cru County. Now, I've pulled the results from Montserrado, where the capital, Monrovia, is listed. And I want you to remember those Afrobarometer survey data. 2/3 majority in 2012 as well as 2018, viscerally opposed to dual citizenship. But look at the referendum results. If you look at Montserrado County, where Monrovia is located, there's an even split between yes and no valid ballots, even though that there were more invalid ballots than valid ballots. But we're just considering the valid ballots. So out of the valid ballots, about 96,356 Liberians in Montserrado supported dual citizenship, right, in this national referendum. About 97,000 said absolutely not. It's a small margin of error between the two, right? So let's say it's an even 50-50 split. But in the 2012 as well as the 2018 Afrobarometer survey, 2/3 opposed dual citizenship. So the argument that I'm making throughout the book, and even after the book was published, is that at this point, Liberians are becoming more and more enamored, or maybe enamored is a strong word, but more accepting of the possibility of dual citizenship being a development enabler, and perhaps not as reproducing inequalities in a way that people did when I interviewed them in 2012, 2013, 2014, right? Like warming up to the idea, right? And as a result, perhaps Liberia at this point is inching closer and closer and closer to getting rid of its outlier status. Because I remember I said earlier that Liberia at the time, when I was doing this research, was one of 7 countries in the continent of Africa that prohibited dual citizenship, really, a minority amongst minorities, right? So these results really demonstrated to me that, okay, maybe something is on the horizon, that perhaps dual citizenship is inevitable for Liberia, given its migratory history, given the fact that there's so many Liberians who live abroad because of conflict and political upheaval, right? So that was the conclusion that I drew from these 2020 national referendum results. There's always a but, though, right? However, what I argue and what I did argue, so this slide is a bit of a selfish self-promotion, shameless self-promotion, I should say. So the photo on the right is basically a photo of me presenting my findings as well as my policy recommendations to the Liberian Senate. And for me, this was really a moment, like a real moment in the career, because there are very few of us as scholars who actually are able to engage with policymakers in a way that's incredibly meaningful. So in 2021, the Liberian House of Representatives passed a dual citizenship bill, and it passed a bill that I think is probably the most progressive bill we've seen in a 10-year time frame, right? They passed the bill in November 2021, and the way it works is we've got a bicameral house. So the House of Representatives is the lower house, and the Senate is the upper house. So the lower house passed the bill, and they sent it back, or they sent it to the Senate for either concurrence or rejection. And the Senate pro temp had been told about my book. I don't know what angel whispered in his ear that, you know, there's this Liberian scholar based at the LSE who's written this fantastic book, and she has all these ideas about dual citizenship. You should invite her. She's been doing research for about 10 years. So I get a call from the pro temp of the Liberian Senate, and he says, Robtel, we need to decide on this bill. It's just been passed. We need you to come to Liberia and tell us what we should do. Well, he didn't really say it in those words. I'm just paraphrasing here. But essentially, he wanted me to come to Liberia and tell them about the book. What were the things that I found out in terms of this empirical research, and to give them some pointers about what to do with the House bill. Now, of course, I had already read the House bill, and at that point, I realized, okay, if we're gonna pass a dual citizenship bill, this is as close as we're gonna get in terms of a really progressive bill. So I said, okay, why not? So I go to Liberia, and I do present my findings, as well as my policy recommendations. So one of the things that I said to the Senate is Liberia has to take a very gradual, phased approach to dual citizenship, given that there's so much contestation in the country. We have to listen to these domestic anxieties, right? Because they're valid and they're important. Whether it's a matter of perception or reality, the fact of the matter is people feel very, very concerned. And these anxieties are based on empirical, or not even empirical, but like tactile experiences of Liberians evading public trust. The other thing I talk about in the presentation to the Senate is that Liberia also has to think about how do we reconcile the 1973 Aliens and Nationality Law, which strictly prohibited dual citizenship, and the 1986 Constitution, which is more permissive, right? So we have to be able to reconcile the contradictions between these two laws. Obviously, the 1986 Constitution is the supreme law of the land, but the Aliens and Nationality Law has to be aligned with that, right? Now, the final law does this. It does this reconciliation between the 73 Aliens and Nationality Law and the Constitution. So thumbs up for the House of Representatives. The other thing I talk about with the Senate is we have to reform the judiciary, right? A lot of the kind of domestic anxieties that I kept hearing over and over again were based on people's concerns about evasion of laws, right? So we've got all these really great regulations on the books. We've got these standing laws that people just do not follow, right? One of the things that kept coming up over and over again in my interviews with Liberians in the country as well as outside of the country is you are a citizen through your practices of abiding by the laws of the nation state, right? Those contributions are part of that. And so Liberians in the country who had experienced the evasion of the law by Liberians who'd come from abroad as returnees or importees said, well, how do we tighten up our laws in such a way that people who evade the public trust as private citizens, but as also public servants, don't get away with it, pack up their bags and leave? Because we've experienced that already, right? And the bill wasn't even a law at the time. So tighten up judicial reform in such a way that people then feel comfortable with the passage of dual citizenship. Last but certainly not least, I would say the most importantly, I told the Senate, we have to address the fact that Liberia is one of the most unequal countries in the world, in the continent of Africa and West Africa, right? So inequalities around income. How do we ensure that if a law of this nature is passed, those that we might recruit from abroad are not paid significantly more because they happen to have experiences abroad, right? This is the experience of the diasporas. How do we ensure that that diasporas does not reproduce these kinds of unequal pay? How do we also look at inequality around access to land? So during the war in Liberia, a lot of Liberians who left with large tracts of land that they left fallow for a number of years, right? And many people left rural Liberia, came to the city, and then squatted on this land for a number of years. So a lot of these squatters now occupy land, occupy territory that really doesn't belong to them legally. You pass dual citizenship. Remember I said earlier that citizenship and land ownership inextricably tied. You can't own land unless you're a citizen. If you pass dual citizenship, many Liberians abroad will come back and claim that land that squatters are sitting on. So how do we reconcile concerns around access to land, equitable access to land? And then last but certainly not least, around issues of transitional justice. I mentioned, kind of alluded to the fact that many Liberians who lived abroad supported their families through remittances during the armed conflict, yes, but some of them also supported rebel factions through financial contributions, right? And some of these Liberians were also implicated in our Truth and Reconciliation report as holding the most responsibility for the perpetuation of war crimes, right? So how do we ensure that people who perpetuate war crimes or even economic crimes, perhaps during war, perhaps during political upheaval, are held to the law of the land, yeah? Then I said to them, how do we extend rights to those who may have two citizenships while also extracting responsibilities from? And there are a lot of examples from the continent of Africa. So right, you extend rights to vote in national elections or legislative elections, or maybe one of the things you might do in terms of extracting responsibilities is restrictions on holding certain lucrative positions of public office. So Minister of Defense, I would say that that's a position that you don't give to somebody who has two passports just because of concerns around divided loyalties, right? President, perhaps, is a position that we don't allow people with two passports to hold, right? And they agreed. They said elected offices will be, dual citizens would not be able to hold elected offices, but certain appointed positions they would be able to hold. The other thing I talked about is, yes, extend the right to own land, because that's inextricably tied to citizenship, but perhaps ensuring that people are paying property taxes, or perhaps even income taxes, which is a more controversial kind of proposition. And then last but certainly not least, we've got an Office of Diaspora Affairs, operationalize it, because there needs to be some interface with the government and those who live abroad. If we say we want to harness their political, economic, and social potential, we have to have an office that facilitates that process, right? So those are some of the recommendations that I made based on my findings. Now I'm going to wrap up here and say that if you are very, very, very intrigued by the dual citizenship law that was eventually passed in July 2022, and I'm happy that I had some sort of contribution to that. It is online, but if you're interested in a sort of précis of the process of 2008 suspension, between 2008 and 2018, the suspension of the law, and then the eventual passage into 2022, there's a really fantastic Al Jazeera op-ed or story that was written by a Liberian journalist entitled All You Need to Know About Liberia's New Dual Citizenship Law. And I'm going to do a little bit more shameless self-promotion and say that I'm quoted in this story, so I'm really, really proud of it. And I think Doina did a fantastic job in just putting all of the facts and figures together. So that's a story that you can read on Al Jazeera. And then if you're interested in purchasing the book, you can purchase it online, but I also have copies here, and I will autograph them for you. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Robtel. That was fascinating. I think for that institute, we work with the state development, and to have such a fresh perspective on this is really important for us. For really, thank you for coming and enlighten us with all this. Yeah, so we have Robtel's book here. Well, you're gonna have drinks afterwards, so you can talk over drinks and get her autograph. Also, I should have mentioned at the beginning of this talk that Professor Saskia couldn't come today. She isn't feeling well, and she sent her apologies and so on. So before we open for questions, I have a few comments regarding the book, your talk, your research, and then I open to the floor so you can contribute as well. So in the first point, it's more like comments, and you feel comfortable, feel free to step in. But one thing that really got my attention when reading your book, and I came across your book I know it was during the pandemic, so it's probably over a year ago, is how your book represents a challenge to the mainstream view of development, and you highlight that several times. And I think, from my perspective, what was very interesting, and perhaps that is because you're a Liberian or because of your post-colonial approach, but it's to discuss development from a perspective doesn't have the European standpoint. It's not a Eurocentric standpoint regarding policies and development policies and praxis, because very often this kind of approach undermine the complexity of all the different realities we have across the globe, as you so correctly explained to us. So I really, this is something that got my attention, is, Robtel, made it look very easy how you do this kind of research, but it's not, especially if you're doing development. That's not the kind of research we're gonna come across. We're talking about that. Tristan is one of my students who wants to do development in a different way. Here we go. That's a good way, someone really interesting for you to talk to, because we know in a more standard discussion of development, we don't get that perspective. And I think it's still in that discussion is a way to challenge the neoliberal approach to development, as we also mentioned, but also, and you also mentioned that, this vulgar view regarding migration flows, because it's true, again, in this more traditional development research setting is always like, global South wants to go to the global North, and all these problems that we see, especially in mainstream media, which doesn't help and cause divides and so on. But and also is where to come across a discussion of this kind of local, the near diaspora migration, right? Which I didn't know was over 80%. So it's really fascinating to come across this kind of research, which from my perspective, it shows how serious a scholar like you is. So that's my first point: development, the different approach to development, and how that's important. And if you want to add more on this, we'll be very grateful. The second point is regarding citizenship and identity, and how complex that is. And another aspect that very often we don't really study enough in development, or let alone in economics, right? And I think, I really like the citizen triad you showed us. And I know you're saying that's not very unique from Liberia, but I think it's quite important as well to highlight that the way you were able to build that kind of concept was interviewing, was having this contact with the local, right? Which is, again, this way of doing research. And I think it's quite interesting to note that very often we just come across with the conception of identity from this passive perspective. I come from a country that is so diverse, and there are many scholars trying to discuss identity in Brazil. But I think I had never come across a discussion in terms like we have the passive, we have the interactive, and you have the active, and then together with that the issue of rights and obligations, which I think is very particular of countries that have such a complex history when you're talking about the state-nation formation and building and so on. And then how you bring into that discussion that's not a minor point, because the political economy of that aspect is how we mentioned trust, the question of land, for example, which was, who gets the best public sector job? Now you're getting some. This relationship between identity, citizenship, development, but also, how that is translated in political, in a practice of development. It was, from my perspective, who have been working with development in a heterodox aspect for a very long time, is even more heterodox than the heterodox in a way, because it really takes attention to that aspect. And my final point is a bit long, so don't get too excited, it's the final, is regarding the state. And the reason why is a long point perhaps is because, as I said, it's something very close to our heart here at IPP, the role of the state. And I know you have section, I think it's chapter 6, on the dilemmas of the state, nation versus
state building.
Building, and that's, I don't know if I'm going towards that direction, but I'd love to talk more about that. But one thing I really like about what your approach to the state is that very often when you're looking at countries, especially countries that were ex-colonies, we have that national struggles when it comes to building the state, right? And if I understood well, Liberia didn't have that kind of history. It's quite interesting, and still the struggle, the conflict was there, which is the question of identity as well. But one thing that really came to my attention, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the political scientist Evaristo Benea. No, I don't know where he's based. Sorry, that was a short. Anyway, but it's a work where it was the first time I started looking into the conception of a state from a different perspective, because he's challenging how we understand the state in Africa. Basically, that's his work. And I have what he's saying, that we have to try to understand the state in Africa as a colonial state, obviously, but what that means, which, if I understood his work well, is very much this violent state, right? And it's interesting because it takes us back to this Eurocentric approach, because from his perspective, and I wonder your take, and I'm sure it's very similar, he's saying that the state in Africa has been mischaracterized as a neutral institution, devoid of a problematic history which affects its present. And then he goes and says, in its simplest terms, the state is an institution of governing a political organization whose main aim is to establish and maintain security, law, and order within a certain geographic jurisdiction. I never know how to pronounce the word, sorry. So that word. So in economics, he's saying the state is discussed and perceived as one size fits all institution, which has to do with IMF, World Bank, the neoliberal policies. And that is not only that is a conception that follows what we see in Europe or in other countries or in America, but he's saying the African state is everything but not that. He's trying to get our attention that the African state is a product of conquest, colonialism, genocides, and slavery. And the consequence, and how we understand that, is quite important for everything we want to kind of think in terms of Africa. And he sees, and that's another point I have for you, he sees that history of the state in Africa as a state being building to achieve this kind of goals and not a peaceful state. And that means the state by default in African countries will be a violent state. So so I just want to trying to bring that together with your conception of state, especially now that the bill has passed, and it seems to me it was a very positive thing. You just said it's the more progressive bill we've seen in 10 years, how that probably comes together with that description of state from this perspective, which, is kind of very pessimistic in a way. So that is my last point, really. And perhaps one thing that came to my mind, if although you touched that a little bit, is the bill has passed in 2022, now July, and I wonder if you look back at your research, what would be something you changed that's different in what actually, I didn't know you were that involved with that, so it's kind of interesting, but if you could highlight more how you see your contribution to that bill, would be great. Yeah. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Really, really great points. I want to talk about the state in Africa, but to your immediate point about, so I think the bill is progressive, but if I were writing it, it would look like a very different bill. So the caveat that I have it's the most progressive bill we've had in like a 15-year period, because it does reconcile that sort of gender discrimination against women being able to pass on citizenship to their children. And this Al Jazeera piece talks about this. I think sometimes I feel like I'm always the Lone Ranger or the Maverick saying, no, the pessimistic scholar. But what I'm concerned about in terms of the bill is that there are things that I recommended to the Senate that were not embedded in the bill. And one of the things that I recommended was what happens, because there have been cases in which people have been denationalized. I think you've heard about that, specifically within the context of maybe UK citizens who go and fight for the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, and then their UK citizenship it's stripped away from them. But international law says effectively that you can't take citizenship away from someone if they will become stateless as a result, right? So one of the things that I said to the Senate is that if we are going to enact dual citizenship, there has to be some sort of caveat that says, if you evade the law of Liberia, you can be denationalized, provided that your other citizenship doesn't create some sort of statelessness situation. Because the law is not foolproof. I think that there are a lot of things within the law. It doesn't address the issue around land ownership explicitly. It doesn't address the issue around income inequality. There are lots of things that the law just does not take into consideration. And when I spoke to the chief sponsor of the finalized bill, he said, Robtel, we can't put everything in one law. So my pushback was, we need to have a dual citizenship 2.0, right? And I would like to write that dual citizenship 2.0. So I would, as sort of a supplement to the bill, state, okay, then what are the rights of would-be dual citizens? What are their responsibilities, and what are the consequences of not fulfilling those responsibilities? And I don't think that the law reconciles that. So it's progressive in the sense that it's the most progressive we've seen, but I don't think it goes far enough in terms of dealing with these concerns around inequality. I don't think it addresses the reproduction of inequality in a way that's meaningful and important for those, specifically for those interviewees that I spoke to years and years and years ago. So that would be my response. I would tweak the law differently, or I would have a supplement, dual citizenship 2.0, that then addresses all of the concerns that came up during the interviews that I conducted. Now, that's not to say I'm not going to still do that, because the next phase of the project is to answer that question explicitly. Does dual citizenship reproduce inequalities? Because now we have a law that I can track and measure, and then go back to policymakers and say, you see, I told you so. Or maybe no, or maybe say, no, you see, I told you so, but I was actually wrong. So it's to test out that hypothesis, that rhetorical question that I posed to you, does dual citizenship reproduce inequalities, is the next phase of the research, because we've got a bill that we can now track, right? In terms of your questions about the state, this is a scholar that I need to look into, but I think of the state in Africa slightly differently. So there's a scholar, and I mentioned it kind of in a footnote. I probably should have made it more prominent in the researches. There's a scholar by the name of Christian Lund, who talks about the state within the context of Africa, but also looking at the state in other post-independence contexts. Because I tried not to use post-colonial because I think it naturalizes colonialism. So post-independence context, where he argues that the state, so there's a difference. There's another scholar by the name of Peter Abrams who says that we need to stop thinking about the state idea, right? So there's an idea that we have of the state, but he says that's the state idea. We need to be looking at the empirical state, right? So how does a state actually function in reality, as opposed to having these notions of what a state should be, especially a state that is a post-independent state, right? And then modeling after that the Western kind of state, right? Because context is very, very important. Contexts are different, right? So state formation may look very different in Liberia than it would in the UK because of that historical trajectory being incredibly, incredibly different. So state idea versus the empirical state. But then Christian Lund builds on this and he says that as far as he's concerned, the state, you can't equate the state to government. And governance is not the same as government, or government is not the same as governance. Because at the end of the day, what the state is, just broadly defined, is different actors, institutions, as well as individuals exercising public authority at different levels, right? And if they're exercising public authority at different levels, people who perform state-like functions may not necessarily be government officials. They can be chiefs, they can be NGOs, they can be prominent people who've just done really well and are respected and regarded well. So they would be considered states. They would be considered part of the state as far as Christian Lund is concerned. And I really like that idea because within the context of Liberia, especially when the state broke down in the midst of an armed conflict, there were Liberians abroad. There were Liberians in the country who were performing state-like functions who were not government officials, right? As far as I'm concerned, they are a part of the state because they were exercising a public authority at different levels. So that's how, I mean, when I think about the state in Africa, I subscribe to with Christian Lund's as well as Peter Abrams' idea, the empirical state, but then also who's exercising public authority at different levels and whose power is legitimated and recognized, who may not necessarily be government officials, right?
Yeah, no, fantastic.
So.
No, yeah, an empirical state, I like it. Let's push that at IPP as well. Well, thank you very much. So yeah, let's open for question, please.
Or comments.
Or comments, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. It's not my field at all, but I'm really interested in it.
Also, can you please just say who
Introduce
you are?
yourself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
right.
Sorry. Yeah.
My name is Mike. I'm based at Imperial College, but I'm basically a fairly independent scholar now. Because Imperial College don't particularly like what I do. But that's another story. One of the things that I found interesting, unless I missed it, is language. Maybe language isn't a factor in, I don't know enough about Liberia, but in most analogous situations, whether people speak the colonial language is a really big dividing, particularly inequalities of power depend on that. So in parts of Africa, it might be English, it might be Portuguese, it might be French, and so on. You didn't mention it at all. I don't think I missed it. Is that because Liberia is entirely English speaking? I don't think. Is it really?
Well, I'll respond, but
even the people who aren't descendants of in-migration.
I'll respond. So your question is about language. How does language factor into all of this?
Yeah, I have a second question. But
No, you can ask your second question. I'll remember that one. That's a good question.
Isn't so much on this project, but maybe part of what you mentioned about your second project, but I'm just interested in it. The history of Liberia, as I understand it, is sort of dominated by this in-migration of really powerful people from abroad. United States, but also other places, as you said. I was at a seminar at the Economic History Department in LSE about 5 or 6 years ago, and there was a very interesting discussion which was saying maybe we should think of Liberia as black settler colonialism. Now, the phrase white settler colonialism is widely used. I don't know if it's approved of, but I've heard of it. Let's say it's not my field. For places like Zimbabwe, South Africa, and many other places where Europeans settled. is Liberia like that, except it's black settler colonialism? And is that something that people talk about? Because the way you describe the history and its implications for the present day remind me very much of settler colonialism of whatever colour. So
yeah, two very good questions. So the language issue, what was interesting is that it didn't come up so Liberia has 16 recognized languages, right? And these 16 languages are based on ethnic groups. English is the official language, but you've got all these 16 languages, right? And these 16 languages are based on the 16 ethnic groups that existed and lived in Liberia before the settlers arrived. Although even these so-called indigenous groups are not indigenous. So one of the things that I say to Liberians when we're having conversations is we're all immigrants at the end of the day, because these 16 indigenous groups came from other parts of West Africa in the same way that settlers came from outside of the continent as well.
It's like Britain, by the way.
Exactly. But I think if you think about it this way, these contestations around who belongs and who doesn't, it becomes moot. Because we all belong, but we all don't belong simultaneously, right?
Yeah.
So it's an intervention that I made, and many people were not really happy with that particular intervention. But because then it forces people to realize that this idea of autochthony and indigeneity is just it's false. It doesn't really exist, you know. So what's interesting about your question around language is when I did speak to some people, because one of the critiques of the book, and I think it's a valid critique, is, oh, but you don't talk about kin-based citizenship. You don't talk about ethnicity-based citizenship. Your framework of citizenship is very nation-state centric. It's almost Westphalian. And I said, well, I basically just formulated these ideas or conceptualizations of citizenship based on the interviews. I didn't manufacture them, right? They're based on the interviews. And when I interviewed people, it was rare for someone to say you have to belong to one of the indigenous, ethnic groups in order to claim Liberian citizenship. Like you have to claim indigeneity in order to be a Liberian citizen. That rarely came up. But some people did say, in answer to your question, that you have to speak a Liberian language in order to claim Liberian citizenship. That's a part of that passive side of the citizenship triad.
So that would be normal in certainly the sub-Saharan African countries.
Well, depends.
That would be a big thing.
It depends. I find that in Liberia, a lot of the 16 indigenous languages, some of them are almost dying out because people will claim a certain civilizational kind of sophistication. Because I speak English really, really well. And that's been passed down from our parents. I remember I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my parents always said, we didn't teach you Kru and Bassa because we wanted you to perfect the English language. And my pushback is always, but you've basically handicapped me. Because these are languages, there's nothing wrong. In fact, there's nothing more powerful than being multilingual, right? And being fluid in that multilingualism. So some people did mention being able to speak a so-called indigenous language is what enables you to claim Liberian citizenship or Liberian citizenship authenticity. And if you can't speak those indigenous languages, you're not really a Liberian. In the same way that some Liberians who experienced the war said, if you didn't experience the war, if you ran away, you chickened out, you're not really a Liberian. And the response that I got from a lot of Liberians abroad is, I don't need to dodge bullets to claim Liberian citizenship authenticity. Yeah, I left because there was a war. And if you had a choice, you would have left as well, right? So, I mean, language came up, but it wasn't prominent in terms of the responses. When I asked people, the question was very broad. It was, who do you consider to be a Liberian citizen? And then all of these kinds of features came up, right? Do you pay taxes? Can you speak an indigenous language? All kinds of features of Liberian citizenship. And that's how I formulated the triad based on what kinds of responses came up more prominently than others. In response to your question about black settler colonialism, I don't think of Liberia, it's a very contested notion in amongst Liberianists, so those who study the country of Liberia. Some people say, yes, it's a function of black settler colonialism. But think about those who came from the United States, those who came from the Congo River Basin, those who came from the Caribbean. They didn't have the kind of, and even Mahmoud Mamdani, he references or alludes to Liberia in his book Citizen and Subject, and he says that it's a form of indirect rule, right? I'm not 100% convinced by that argument because And in my new book, I'm doing more of this in terms of going into the archive to get a sense of who were these people who came from these different places? Who were these settlers? Many of them were, yes, some of them were free. Some of them were manumitted who bought their freedom. But if you compare those settlers to the other kinds of white settlers who came from other parts and settled in Africa, the kind of power, influence, clout, resources, it's like a no comparison, right? The other thing that I think about when I think about settler colonialism is that there's a certain, the people who came in to Liberia didn't come with, they didn't come with weapons. You know what I mean? Like I think about the certain resources.
In terms of white settler colonialism.
Okay.
Because if you think of the French in Algeria or the Portuguese in Angola, and to a large extent the original white settlers in South Africa, a lot of them were kind of like poor farmers. And they didn't come with, well, they probably did have weapons, but they didn't come, you know, with armies.
With a lot of
They came
resources.
with settlers to protect their cattle or whatever it was. And it was like they were very working class. And with the mass emigrations, that's true in a number of places.
Yeah, but I don't think they came with the kind of colonial, racial slavery baggage that those who came from the Congo River Basin, the United States and the Caribbean is. I mean, it's something that I'm still kind of exploring, but I'm uncomfortable with the idea of conflating or comparing the two because the experiences are quite different. Now, there is a Liberian scholar, my contemporary, Samuel Toe, who's written a brilliant, if you're interested, I can send it to you. He's written a really brilliant article in the Liberian Studies Journal. I think it was published a couple of years ago, making the case for why we can say those settlers who came are emblematic of Black settler colonialism. And for me, it's the most compelling argument that I've read so far, although I don't agree or subscribe to it, but I think it's the most compelling I've read out of anyone who's made or tried to make the case that, you know, this is emblematic of Black settler colonialism. Because I'm really interested in the experiences of the people, what kinds of power, because even in the large geopolitical superstructure, Liberia was a very small nation. It was the only independent nation in Africa when it was established. And it took almost a century for other countries on the continent to claim independence. So there's something about that uniqueness that made it very precarious in the so-called comity of nations. But I'll get your contact information. I'll send you the article and you'll tell me what you think of it. But yeah, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of calling it Black settler colonialism, even though a lot of people do.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I knew you wanted to ask a question.
I'm just curious because I'm from the Bahamas, and this is actually something that is of a major social concern going on right now because we are one of the few countries in the Caribbean that do not recognize dual citizenship. And
oh wow!
I know you mentioned does dual citizenship enact inequality, but thinking from it as someone that's grew up in the Bahamas, I really think that it also limits economic mobility and vitality in some sense because what happened is you have a lot of people in the Bahamas that are Bahamian Americans or Bahamian Canadians just because of the close proximity of these countries. You have a lot of people that are born in these countries, and similar in the Bahamas, whether you have a Bahamian passport restricts a lot of what you can do in the Bahamas in regards to bank accounts because we're very heavily invested in ensuring who can access Bahamian bank accounts. Land as well. And it's interesting because in our law, if you have dual citizenship, you have until your 21st birthday to decide which country you would like to pledge your allegiance to. And I think given our close proximity to a country like the US, it's almost a negative effect for us because what happens is you have people that get to this age, a lot of them, they use these passports, they live abroad, and when it's time for them to decide, they say, well, I have more opportunities here. I want to be a Bahamian. I grew up in the Bahamas, I love the Bahamas, but if I can see myself really settling down here, economically wise, socially wise, I want to stay here. And I don't think politically we really understand that ties into the massive brain drain that is happening inside of the Bahamas because we're very focused on tourism, And you have Bahamians that go abroad, they get very specialized degrees, they help send people to the moon, like Bahamian engineers working with like these different departments that have done phenomenal things in the world. And I understand, like, if you go to the Bahamas and if you go to the US and you get these degrees, and then there's no place for you to come back to the Bahamas because we're so specialized on one particular industry. They're saying, well, I want to go back to help my country, but the industry isn't there, the sector isn't there, it isn't available, which then contributes to them deciding that, well, if I'm in this country, I got cheaper cheaper tuition, I might as well just stay here. And it's just curious to see that as me, as a young Bahamian, that is trying to fight that idea of that I go to another country, I become educated, and I invest myself in that country instead of returning back to my country. How can I continue to change this paradigm of, and it's hard to say that, yeah, you should take a pay cut or something like that to come back, because, everyone has different motivations, everyone has different gears, but just curious to see, like, how can I continue in IIPP? I'm a current MPA student here, and we talk a lot about, changing the narratives and, mission-oriented approaches. So me as a young human studying here, how can I create that synergy to encourage, other people that it's more than just living abroad and, having the better salary? And I know it's very different coming from a person that I'm on a scholarship. So from some sense, I have the privilege where I am able to go abroad and go to school and do things that other people aren't able to do. But it's very curious where I see that this aspect of, restricting where you have your citizenship, I do think it is playing a vital, well, not a vital, I do think it's playing a counterproductive role in the Bahamas when it comes to securing young, bright-minded people and investing back into the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because everything you've said is definitely, it resonates with my experience of Liberia. What I would often tell people when I did live and work for the government is, yes, they always say government creates the enabling environment, but I don't think it's just the government that creates the enabling environment. I think if the tourism sector is what is prominent in Bahamas, then I think Bahamians have to go back and create a different way of opening up the economic kind of productivity of the country so that tourism isn't the be-all and end-all in terms of driving GDP growth. The other thing I would say, and maybe this is a bit of a cynical way of looking at it, is you don't necessarily have to be in a country to make a difference. And I experienced this myself where I consider myself to be a transnational Liberian. So for instance, after this term is over, I'm heading back to Liberia to spend about a week. I've got lectures planned at the University of Liberia. My research is going to continue to be on Liberia. So I feel like in some respects, I'm doing more for Liberia outside of Liberia than I would be able to if I were in the country. So I think there are different ways of serving one's country. It doesn't necessarily have to be like being physically present to do so, although it is important to engage. And you can do that at different stages and different levels. But we have to create the enabling environment as citizens. We can't necessarily expect the government. I'm not expecting my government to create an enabling environment because I don't necessarily believe in the government that's currently in power. So if I'm going to change the dynamics in the country, then I've got to do it in my small kind of ways. The way that I try to do it is to infiltrate, literally infiltrate the policymaking process, so that we're looking at not just how is this going to benefit an economic, political, social elite, but what does it mean for the people on the ground who don't have the wherewithal to leave, who don't have the wherewithal to live abroad, who don't have the wherewithal to accumulate multiple passports so that they have the kind of mobility that some of us do. So I don't know if it's an answer to your question, but I think the onus sometimes is on us instead of waiting for the government to do it, because the government has, in some respects, its own agenda that may not necessarily be our agenda. So
I agree. I definitely think that there is a synergy between civil engagement and the government as well, but I do think that the government does play a role in help guiding. And I sound just like our lectures shaping here,
No, it does. It does.
Allowing, giving some type of incentives to a collaborative effort between diaspora and those abroad to encourage that connection, that they can use these skills that were acquired abroad in a domestic sense.
I agree. And so one of my recommendations to the government was how that Office of Diaspora Affairs that I forgot to mention I helped to establish, we need to operationalize it, because that's the interface that we have with people who are serious-minded, not people who just want to come and take government jobs, because there are a lot of those who want, government appointments, but there are actual Liberians who want to set up businesses. They want nothing to do with government jobs, but they want to, increase economic productivity, create jobs for young Liberians who are unemployed but have the skills. We should be encouraging that kind of contribution, as well as those who want to work for government. So the way that I see it is, how do I infiltrate the policymaking process, and then also encourage my friends and colleagues who are in the trenches, right, like really doing the heavy lifting, to infiltrate in their own ways as well, not just in government, but also in the private sector. So there's a role for all of us to play. And maybe we can talk more about concretely what would that mean for you after you're done with the UCL?
Yeah. Come to LSH, the PhD with Robtel.
Why not?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this, Robtel, and thank you, Mike and Tristan, for the very interesting questions. So if you have more questions, if you want to carry on this conversation, let's go upstairs. But for now, thank you for coming. We have another seminar on the 7th of December, sorry, I don't know why I keep saying September, on inflation. It's going to be a bit boring, not as exciting that, but we need to discuss inflation, so we can't go away from that. So, so please join me to say thank you to Robtel. That was fantastic.